most of the time when people claim they've got some kind of idea that contradicts mainstream science, it turns out to be wrong. But we must always bear in mind the possibility that sometimes it's right. Very occasionally it's right. And so you have to be open to that possibility.
Welcome to Closer to Truth. I'm speaking with anomalistic psychologist Chris French, that's his self-description, about his engaging and controversial new book, The Science of Weird Shit: Why Our Minds Conjure the Paranormal. Chris argues that a full understanding of the human condition must include consideration of the psychological roots of paranormal belief and experiences. Welcome, Chris. It's great to meet. I used to be really interested in all of this. You resurrect some memories. Why is an understanding of the human condition require this consideration of the psychological roots of the paranormal?
And the reason this is important is because there isn't a society anywhere on the planet, either geographically or historically, where people have not held these kinds of beliefs, and a sizable minority of the population claim to have directly had these experiences. Now, it's possible, of course, that that's an indication that some paranormal phenomena are genuinely paranormal in the sense of they are beyond explanation in terms of conventional scientific concepts. But another possibility, and one that really interests me, is that maybe we've all got very similar brains, and we have had for many, many millennia. And maybe what we've got here is a situation where sometimes the neural wiring that we've got leads us to misinterpret, misremember, misperceive, and so on. And maybe psychology can offer better explanations than the paranormal ones.
So, as I hear it, there are really two perspectives that we have in investigating the paranormal. One is to determine the veracity or the real underlying reality of the phenomena, which is traditionally the way people look at it. And the other is to look at it in terms of the psychology of belief systems, why we believe what we believe across a broad front. So there's two different perspectives, and we'll try to keep each one teased apart to some degree so that we can appreciate it. But certainly both are important. And I would absolutely agree with that. So I enjoyed the book in general, but in chapter 1, you have this very long list. I think it goes over 3 pages or so of all the examples, and it's just it's sort of like a tsunami of waves of all of these paranormal ideas. Just throw out a dozen or so. I mean, you must have 100 there or more.
Oh yeah, even that list was only a partial list, Robert. There was a lot more that I could have added in.
Yeah.
I mean, the point of that exercise was to make readers realize that although the paranormal is one of those ideas that we all think we understand what it means, it's actually quite tricky to define in a way that everybody would agree upon. So I kind of put out a load of different phenomena there and ask the readers to just make the decision: do you think this is this is paranormal, or would you not put it in the paranormal basket? So it included things that I think everybody would include. That would be extrasensory perception, which itself includes telepathy, precognition, and clairvoyance, also psychokinesis, and also evidence relating to the possibility of life after death. It would all agree that that's all paranormal. But then we get on to stuff which parapsychologists might not describe as paranormal, but the mass media and myself as an anomalistic psychologist would probably put in that basket. That would include things like UFOs, alien abduction claims, the Bermuda Triangle, astrology, firewalking. The list goes on and on and on. And really, I suppose the way I often summarize that is just to say anything weird and wonderful, the kind of thing that the mass media love to kind of make programs about or have articles about.
So now you use the term everything wild and wonderful, which is a nice, but the book's title is called Weird Shit. And,
Yeah.
so how do you go from this very genteel, wild and wonderful to weird shit?
Well, this started off as a joke. I mean, initially I was going to call the book "Why Weird Stuff Matters," and I still think that's quite a good title because it really gets at what I'm trying to get at in the book.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
But occasionally to a friend, I'd say, or I might just call it the science of weird shit. And almost without exception, people said, "Oh, I'd buy that." So it was purely a marketing ploy.
Right. Okay. Well,
One thing that kind of worried me slightly, we did decide to go with that title in the end, but I don't want people to think that I'm kind of treating this flippantly because I'm not. I do take these things seriously. And of course, that title might imply that I don't, that I think it's all nonsense and doesn't deserve thinking about. And it's quite the opposite. I think these things are really interesting, fascinating, and can tell us something important about human psychology.
good. Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the title kind of fighting against the content. It kind of can be an engaging thing. I mean, I found it that way, and I think that's good. Now, when I looked at the list, it, as you said, included the expected parapsychology stuff like telepathy, but also what I classify as pseudosciences like astrology, as you said, conspiracy theories like fake moon landings, religious claims, angels and demons and miracles, um, crypto creatures, even like the Loch
Mhm.
Ness monster, and even you bring in hypnosis and alternative and complementary medicine, which um, has shown to have some in some cases therapeutic benefits, like aspects of agriculture. So, why do you kind of lump all these together like a collection of random variables, random vegetables in a beef stew? I mean, they're all sort of mixed together.
No, but like, yeah, I wasn't putting forward that list as saying that I believe that all of the following are paranormal. I was getting the reader to think about what they would
Ah,
classify
mm,
as being
mm,
paranormal,
mm.
and the point there was to try to get them to realize that coming up with a definition of paranormal is not that easy. It's an exercise I used to do with my students to ask them if they could come up with a definition that they all agreed about, which would only include things which they genuinely thought were paranormal and would exclude everything else. I get them to do small group discussions, and it brought home to them the fact it's one of those slippery concepts. There's a lot of those in psychology where we all know what that means until you actually have to define it, and then you realize it's not such a straightforward concept.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that completely. And in a few minutes, I want to get to some precise definitions that we can talk about. But I had that experience as well. I last year did a major paper on theories of consciousness called The Landscape of Consciousness. And one out of 200 different theories dealt with what I call the paranormal. And when it was a pre-publication release, I got a lot of very critical comments, including from friends who are parapsychologists who really despise the word paranormal and wanted me to use psi for the scientific. So they in their mind had a very clear distinction that paranormal is to be eschewed from their perspective, but psi reflected the scientific view.
Again, it's an interesting. I mean, this happens a lot, doesn't it? I mean, and again, in psychology in particular, where certain terms, certain phrases become unpopular for various reasons. I mean, we've just seen it in ufology. I still think I still refer to UFOs.
Yeah, me too.
Like,
UAPs don't do it for me.
I don't do it for me either. UFOs is a perfectly descriptive term. It works, but and that happens. I mean, and in a while, probably people will start having objections to the term psi being used, and
Yeah,
they'll come up with
right,
something else. But
right.
as long as I think the important thing is you make it clear what you mean when you are using the phrase, and as long as the reader knows that, then they know where they are.
Yeah, my initial sense in going through the book is that you're framing each of these topics more from the perspective of belief system psychology. Why do we believe what we believe? Why do we want to believe the things that we do? Which is a very valuable probe of human mentality, as you've stated, and we'll cover that in detail, but not as concerned with the veracity of the claims, at least at this point. And one gets the feeling that you seem to suggest, it's not like covert; it's pretty overt. That it's to spend time on the veracity of these things is not very useful, because pretty much all of them are illusion, delusion, fraud, myths, or fables. But in doing that, aren't you? And when I see this list, aren't you painting them all with the same amount of tarnish, dismissing them all with the same level of utter rejection? Now, I, for one, would not assign the same level of utter rejection to, say, telepathy as I would to flat Earth theories.
I think that's a very good point, and I do kind of try to go on my way to say, I mean, one very fundamental point for me as a somebody who self-identifies as a skeptic is that it's a really important aspect of skepticism to be open to the possibility that you might be wrong, and I also acknowledge that there are certain areas within parapsychology that can't be readily dismissed, that are not, we don't have conclusive skeptical counter arguments. I mean, I'd include things like the Ganzfeld studies,
Right.
spontaneous past life memories, and a few other areas. Now, basically, what that means for me is that I think that I'm not convinced by the evidence as it currently stands, but it's not easy to dismiss either. And I'm open to seeing what new data comes in on those fronts, and whether we ever get to a point where some of these things can be established beyond reasonable doubt to the satisfaction of the wider scientific community, we will see. But I certainly don't think that all of these different things should be kind of dismissed. I think the example you gave there, I mean, I think that's a very good example that flat Earth theory would be way, way down the list in terms of possibly being true. But some of these other things, I would say, yeah, they are a real challenge to skeptics. That doesn't mean to say that at the end of the day, I'm going to come down saying, okay, I'm convinced by the evidence. But it's important to treat those kind of areas with respect. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of this. There's a lot of skeptics who will come out with statements like, there is no evidence for the existence of telepathy. Well, that's just nonsense. Of course, there's lots of evidence. There's the evidence from people's everyday experience, but maybe more convincingly for the likes of you and I, there's evidence from things like Ganzfeld studies and so on. I mean, the Ganzfeld studies typically are kind of actually studies of telepathy, where you have a sender and a receiver, and the receiver is in a state of mild perceptual deprivation. The idea is that if telepathy does exist, it's possibly a very, very weak signal compared to all the background noise. So you try to dampen out all that background noise in the hope that the signal will come through. And yeah, there was a recent meta-analysis. I mean, as not surprisingly, written by people who were proponents of the paranormal, but they concluded that 40 years of research suggests that there really is an effect there. They were quite convinced that there was an effect there. I would have my reasons for not being convinced by that. I mean, for one thing, the history of parapsychology has been pretty much a history of false dawns. It's always, they're on the verge of establishing these things, and yet we never quite seem to get there. So I kind of withhold judgment on those things. But as I say, it's important to kind of acknowledge that there is some evidence there that's a bigger challenge to skeptics than others.
Let's try to distinguish the terms that we're using, tease them apart with precise definitions, or as good as we can. And I'd like to distinguish between paranormal, anomalous experiences, which is your core way of thinking, parapsychology, and psi. How would you distinguish those four elements?
I think psi would probably be the term that many parapsychologists would prefer when they're talking about the kind of thing that they are studying, and that probably would be limited to evidence relating to ESP, extrasensory perception, PK, psychokinesis, and evidence relating to life after death. They'd have quite a strict definition that they included those things. They wouldn't go kind of beyond that. When it comes to the term paranormal, then it really depends upon who you ask. For most parapsychologists, again, they would probably prefer that rather strict definition that I've just outlined. Anomalistic psychologists and the mass media would go for the kind of anything weird and wonderful type approach that I mentioned earlier. So parapsychology is the attempt to apply scientific method to testing whether any genuinely paranormal phenomena actually occur. And I mean, an anomalistic psychology takes a kind of more skeptical approach, whereas as a working hypothesis, and I can't emphasize this enough, as a working hypothesis only, we say, well, let's just assume that paranormal forces don't exist. Can we explain the weird experiences that people report in other ways? In other words, in psychological terms. So it's not in a sense that it's opposed to parapsychology, and it's quite possible we can certainly conceive of a situation where, I mean, I think a lot of the time when people believe they've had a paranormal experience, we can be pretty sure they haven't. It can be explained plausibly in terms of conventional scientific concepts, but that doesn't mean that it's always the case that we can explain those things in terms of conventional scientific concepts. So it's possible that both approaches would have something to offer. I've got to the point now where I'm not convinced that any genuine paranormal phenomena exist. And by that, I mean phenomena that cannot be explained in terms of conventional science. But as I keep on emphasizing, I could be wrong. I could be wrong.
Yeah, and give a brief history of your journey, because I really appreciated that, and had some similar experiences myself from your early history, where you were fascinated with the paranormal as a believer, or maybe not quite as a believer, as what I'd call a want to be believer. I think I was in the want to be believer category. To a dogmatic, dismissive skeptic, to now, as you've just described, your more nuanced approach, as expressed in your book.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, all the way through childhood, teenage years, early adulthood, all the way through doing a psychology degree, I would say I was a believer. I thought I took a lot of this stuff very seriously. I mean, just one illustration of that is that while I was doing my PhD to earn a bit of extra cash, I used to give talks at the local adult education college, and they asked for one on parapsychology. I gave them a lecture on parapsychology, which was totally uncritical, totally unskeptical. And they were probably all sitting there thinking, well, he's doing a PhD. He must know what he's talking about. Yeah, I cringe when I look back at that. But then I discovered the joys of skepticism because someone recommended a particular book, and it had a huge impact on my life. It was called Parapsychology, Science or Magic by a Canadian social psychologist called James Alcock. And it was the first book I'd ever read that offered a skeptical perspective on all these topics. And I not only really enjoyed the book, but I found it very convincing. And then really what started off as a kind of side interest, a hobby. And in those initial years of skepticism, I think I kind of became a bit of what I would now see as being a bit of an extreme skeptic. I kind of had various beliefs and attitudes that anybody who claimed to have psychic ability, well, they were either crazy or they were charlatans. There was no possibility of any other explanation. That all paranormal beliefs were kind of dangerous and people shouldn't hold them, and a whole range of other views that I would reject. And I recognize that I may be wrong, but I think that most people who claim that they've got some kind of paranormal abilities, some psychic abilities, genuinely believe that they have. And that's really interesting. And a lot of paranormal beliefs can be psychologically beneficial in various ways. Just because it's not true doesn't mean it's not psychologically helpful. And so, I've kind of gone from being, as I say, a believer to being a fairly extreme skeptic back towards that middle ground. And I find I've got a lot more in common with the moderates on the other side of the debate than some of the extremists on my side.
Hmm. Well, we bond over skepticism for sure. Being skeptical is the DNA of Closer to Truth. I'm skeptical of everything. I'm skeptical of theism. I'm skeptical of atheism. I'm skeptical of agnosticism. And I'm even skeptical about skeptics.
I thought you might be.
We also bonded with respect to Sue Blackmore because, as you wrote much in your book, she influenced your career, and Sue has been a long-term friend. She was on the original pilot of Closer to Truth in 1996, and then several times she's been on 9 Closer to Truth TV stations, so TV episodes. So if you see Sue again, give her my warm regards.
I definitely will. I definitely will.
One question is, how much in rejecting I've seen people reject the evidence of psi because they say it's a priori impossible. And so therefore there must be a flaw in the data or methodological. And a lot of times there is, or maybe all the time. But the flow of the arrow of the argument goes from an a priori assumption that it's impossible to then seeing the data as flawed, as opposed to the other way around, which should be the traditional way of science.
I agree. I don't buy that argument at all. That we know it's impossible. I mean, there have been too many examples in the past where the scientific consensus was wrong. And it's as simple as that. Once upon a time, we didn't believe that meteorites could be rocks flying from outer space because there are no rocks in space. Well, that's wrong. There are, and there's lots of other examples: continental drift, etc., etc. So again, a lot of the time, the parapsychologists will point to those kind of examples and say that science has been wrong, but mainstream science has been wrong before. It's wrong again. I think Carl Sagan was the one who kind of pointed out that yes, okay, they laughed at Galileo, but they also laughed at Bonzo the clown, I think it was, or something like this. I mean, most of the time when people claim they've got some kind of idea that contradicts mainstream science, it turns out to be wrong.
Right.
But we must always bear in mind the possibility that sometimes it's right. Very occasionally it's right. And so you have to be open to that possibility.
Okay. On a scale from 1 to 100, what's the likelihood, in your opinion, that even one paranormal or psi occurrence out of the innumerable anecdotal accounts, discard, but one will permanently escape the explanatory power of science? On a scale of 1 to 10, what's the likelihood that even that one will be found?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I'd maybe say 2.
Okay. All right. All right. I'll hold you to it, Chris. Many thanks, Chris. The Science of Weird Shit is an important contribution to our thinking about belief systems as well as the paranormal, and it's a great read. Chris, let's get a feel for the arc of the book by just getting some highlights from each of the chapters. The first chapter you call Weird Science, and you talk about the prevalence of belief. What is that in terms of populations by country or by some kind of demographic?
Well, there is obviously, as you'd expect, there is variation from country to country, and there's variation across time as well. But you will typically find a large proportion of the population that will endorse various paranormal beliefs. There's more survey data available from the US and from the UK than from a lot of other countries. But what we typically find there is that if you have a kind of standard array of paranormal phenomena, the majority of the population will endorse at least one of those. And so about half the population report that they kind of believe in life after death. About a third of the population believe in psychokinesis, the alleged ability to influence the outside world by thought alone. Similar kinds of figures for telepathy. And again, the kind of whole range. There's not much difference between the US and the UK. You do find kind of more. It depends on how you're going to define the paranormal, of course, but you'll find that there's more belief in kind of things like the literal existence of demons in America, no doubt because of the influence of Christian fundamentalism. There's much greater there, obviously, than over here.
Not to mention the political system.
Well, I couldn't possibly.
That's a joke.
Yeah. Interestingly, again, no surprise, Republicans are much more likely to believe in the reality, the literal reality of Satan and demons than are Democrats. But again, that's interesting in itself, the way these things reflect different belief systems.
Yeah, and you find a high correlation between, for example, belief in life after death, which is related to the Christian belief system, and belief in the paranormal. Are there very high cross correlation between them, or?
It's interesting. There are correlations. I mean, there are a couple of interesting ideas. When you think about this, you could potentially argue it either way. On the one hand, you might say, well, because a lot of religions, which are obviously clearly of central importance to many people, already say that life after death is a reality, that people who are religious may well be more likely to say they also believe in paranormal phenomena that relate to life after death.
Yeah, sure.
On the other hand, another argument that was put forward was what was referred to as the spiritual void hypothesis. This is the idea that we all have a need for certain spiritual beliefs, and if traditional religions aren't satisfying those needs, we might turn to New Age ideas and paranormal. And so in one case, you'd expect a positive correlation. In the other case, you'd expect a negative correlation. If you actually look at the data, it's complicated. It depends on the particular religion, the particular context, and so on and so forth. Some religions explicitly condemn any kind of belief in the paranormal kind of outside their own religious belief system. So there's all kinds of factors that come into play.
Yeah, but what is clear is that there is a high ubiquity of the importance of some kind of paranormal, as you've described it in the broadest terms, whether it's religious or parapsychological or new agey stuff. There is a deep hunger in the human psyche for some sort of meaning beyond the self.
There does seem to be. There does seem to be. I mean, I think I personally don't feel those kind of spiritual yearnings. It's it's not to say that I don't get a kind of sense of awe when I look out at the stars at night and so on and so forth. I get all that, but I don't necessarily think of that as being a spiritual experience. So, I mean, there are kind of atheists and materialists who maybe don't feel that they've got that need, but they very much seem to be in a kind of minority. Most people, one way or another, as you are saying, have some kind of spiritual beliefs, whether it be religious or New Age ideas or whatever else it may be.
In the chapter, you talk about how anomalistic psychology gets insights from psychological sub-disciplines. Give me some sense of that in terms of your analytical process. What ideas do you call upon from other areas of psychology that you can apply to anomalistic psychology?
Well, it's essentially, I mean, each of the different sub-disciplines of psychology have kind of got something to offer in terms of potential explanations for the kinds of phenomena that we're interested in. So if you think of developmental psychology, for example, how do these kind of beliefs and ideas develop across childhood and into adulthood? I mean, we tell our kids all kinds of things about, a big fat guy in a red suit who comes down the chimney at Christmas time and brings them toys, and this time of the year, the Easter Bunny, and all this kind of stuff. So we we actually deceive our children into believing all this magical stuff, and it's really interesting to look at how kids develop in terms of at a very early age. They're quite likely to believe in the literal reality of magic, but then they'll become more skeptical. At what point do they decide that actually Santa doesn't exist, and so on and so forth? So that's kind of one element. That's one example. But we can look at neuropsychology. We can look at how that might explain things like out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences or sleep paralysis, a whole range of phenomena.
Temporal lobe epilepsies.
Yeah, absolutely. All of that stuff is relevant. We can turn to basically pretty much any side of psychology. Cognitive psychology, we can look at all the cognitive biases that we all suffer from and how are they relevant to explaining why we might misperceive certain situations and so on. I mean, the list goes on. In fact, the previous book that I co-authored with Anna Stone that you kindly referred to, we took the approach there of actually just looking at each of the different sub-disciplines of psychology and saying, what can this tell us? And we have chapters on evolutionary psychology, on social psychology, the whole range.
So chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 deal with different kinds of anecdotes, stories. Everyone has some story, but chapter 2 is on nightmares, 3 is on encounter with ghosts, 4 is communicating with the dead, 5 is memories of alien encounters. Um, these stories are rich, they're interesting, they're certainly although no doubt there are huge numbers of hoaxes and delusions, but they are certainly to a large degree believed by the people who have had them. And you give some very poignant and powerful examples. Pick one or two examples that really um, were profound in your exploration of this whole paranormal area.
Well, one of the topics that absolutely fascinates me, and there's quite a long chapter in the book about this, is sleep paralysis, which is this in its most basic form. It is pretty much precisely what it says on the tin. It's a temporary period of paralysis that occurs between sleep and wakefulness, and sometimes that's all it is. And if you experience that, it's a bit disconcerting, but it's no big deal. But it can be associated with other symptoms that can make it absolutely terrifying. They include things like a very strong sense of presence. There's something in the room with you. It's occurring while you're in bed, it's in the dark, you can't move, and you've got this sense that there's some kind of evil presence in there with you. But you might actually hallucinate. You might see monstrous figures. You might see lights moving around the room or dark shadows. You might hear voices or footsteps. You get pressure on the chest and difficulty breathing. You feel there's something trying to strangle you. And I get sent lots of first-hand accounts of sleep paralysis because people know I'm interested in it. And this is coming from people who've already decided that it was a hallucinatory experience. That's why they're sending their accounts to me rather than to the priest or the psychiatrist, and yet still reading them, they are so creepy that you can. I mean, the thing is, the important point is, while it's happening, it feels real. It feels incredibly real, and these are real experiences that people have, and often kind of don't know what to make of them. So I kind of, part of the reason I want to get the word out there about sleep paralysis is to reassure people that yes, it's incredibly scary, but it's not real.
Sleep paralysis, I completely understand from that perspective. But, some of the others, encounters with ghosts or communicating with the dead, have any of these stories, and you've been a collector, I would assume, of hundreds of real firsthand accounts, have any of them made you think twice and rattle your skepticism, or not a one?
It's it's not something that is likely to happen on the basis of that anecdotal evidence, because I am aware as a psychologist of how unreliable memory can be. I'm aware of the existence of false memories. I'm aware of all the ways in which we can misperceive things, we can misinterpret things, and so on. So, anecdotal evidence like that is never going to be enough on its own to convince me. And even if it was me that was having those experiences, I shouldn't kind of think, oh, well, that proves it's true then. I'm just as prone to those kind of biases as anybody else.
I'm,
Uh,
I'm, I'm with you on that. People write into Closer to Truth and say I should take psychedelics and see the reality of the world. And my answer to that is I haven't and I don't. My answer is that if I did and I saw that, I wouldn't believe it. I wouldn't believe any experience, emotional, spiritual experience that I would have would be enough to convince me that it were the case.
yeah, no, I mean, I fully agree with you on that one. Um, but it's interesting that when people have those kinds of experiences, they can get that subjective sense of absolute certainty. There's nothing that could shake them from the belief at that point. I mean, and skeptics often get accused of being closed-minded. Well, for me, being closed-minded is not being able to answer the question, what would convince you that you're wrong? Yeah,
Hmm.
now say something like telepathy, I can tell you, what kind of data would convince me that telepathy really does exist. Whereas somebody who's just absolutely certain on the basis of their own experience, you can say, what would convince you that you're wrong? And there's nothing. They know they're right.
Chapter 6, as you call Many Happy Returns, great title, and it's a chapter about reincarnation, past lives. A rough percentage of people who believe in reincarnation or past lives,
Well, that would depend which country you took the data from.
right?
Because, I mean, although surprisingly, even in the UK and probably the US, I think would be similar. It's about 25%, which is it's just a very high number when you think about it. In other countries, of course, it can be virtually the whole population. And there are religions where reincarnation is a really important part of the religion, and therefore pretty much everybody would believe in it.
Yeah, there's a reincarnation and past lives deal. They sound like they're the same thing, but they're not quite. Reincarnation has a connotation of within a religious belief system of karma and sort of a naturalistic process of of fundamental reality, how it works in schools of Hinduism and schools of Buddhism, not all in each, of course. And in past lives in the West, it has its different connotation. It's sort of sounds the same, but they're really quite different.
Yeah, I mean, there's in the book I divide them into two. I divide past life memories into two different general types. There's the one that is based on hypnotic regression,
Uh-huh.
and I think the evidence there, certainly to me, is very compelling that what we're dealing with there are false memories. There's all kinds of reasons for my saying that. One is that typically, if someone is hypnotically regressed back into a past life, the version of the life that they describe is the Hollywood version. It's not the historically accurate version. It's based on films they've seen, etc., etc. And there's a lot of other evidence as well, which
Yeah.
I would.
Have you looked at the so-called database of past lives from the Division of Perceptual Studies, University of Virginia, that Ian Stevenson started, Bruce Grayson, and others have perpetuated?
I've not looked at that in any depth, I'll confess. And my own experience of kind of doing any of that kind of research is limited. I'll acknowledge that. I took part in a documentary back in the late 90s where we went to Lebanon to investigate reincarnation claims amongst the Druze. And to be honest, I didn't really know what to expect. But I came back from that experience pretty much convinced that the cases that we looked at were almost certainly based on false memories. Now, there are other cases which I think would be much harder to explain in psychological terms. So, as I say, there are only a limited number of hours in a day, and no, I have not looked in any depth into
Yeah,
those cases.
I've been encouraged to look at that as well, and I have not taken the time to do it yet either. One fascinating argument among the sci folks that I've enjoyed is the argument against talking to the dead or past lives, against it from what's called super psi. And super psi is the sense that people who claim to have a past life or people who talk to the dead are actually getting data in a clairvoyant
Mhm.
sense or something from a real paranormal or real psi experience, but it's not a past life and it's not talking to the dead. And some would argue that it's impossible logically to distinguish among the two. And this is an intra psi believer community. And I find that argument a very interesting one.
Yeah, no, it is an interesting argument, and but as you say, there'd be the conceptual difficulty of being able to tease those two possibilities apart. I mean, in the same way that when you actually stop and think it through, it's pretty much impossible to separate telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition from each other.
Right.
And J.B. Ryan, I think, preferred the term general ESP just to try and get around that problem. But yeah, it's. I mean,
Right.
as I say, I'm not convinced that there is anything paranormal going on in those cases. Could be wrong. So I'm not going to try and worry too much about whether it might be this version or that version until I'm convinced that there really is something there to be explained.
Chapter 7, Dying to Know the Truth, you deal with near-death experiences, NDAs. And I have to tell you, that over the years, the most criticism that Closer to Truth has gotten has been from people who say we have not explored NDEs in our ontological search for existence and sentience and all the work we've done, and we give a lot of credence to philosophers of religion who believe in the non-physical and God. We deal with a lot of non-physical theories and consciousness, but I've not had the strong motivation to include explorations of NDEs in the ontological search. It's certainly a real phenomenon and can be investigated. And so, from your perspective of the range of explanations for near-death experiences, which are the ones you favor?
Well, you probably won't be too surprised to. Basically, I would tend to prefer the neuropsychological explanations. They certainly need to be fleshed out in more detail. One of the reasons that I tend to favour those kind of explanations is that every single component of the near-death experience sometimes occurs outside of the context of a near-death experience. And it's often easier to study them outside that context because obviously, by definition, near-death experiences tend to occur at unpredictable times, and you've not got the equipment and the facilities to be able to study them, except in very rare circumstances. So, for example, if we wanted to study the out-of-body experience, there are certain people who claim that they can induce an out-of-body experience more or less at will just by engaging in various mental exercises. Well, that's a much easier hypothesis to test. There's no reason to believe that their out-of-body experiences are different from the ones of a near-death experience.
Right,
We sit
right.
someone down in this chair where I'm sitting now. We get them to have an out-of-body experience and tell me what's in the room, on the table in the room opposite. And that's it. That would prove it. The skeptics would be defeated. And yet, despite claims for decades and decades, nobody's ever been able to do that. And so, similarly with the kind of other components of the near-death experience, they're often easier to study outside of the context of a near-death experience. And it's going to take some kind of synthesis of putting all those bits and pieces together, like people like Sue Blackmore have attempted to do. But we at least are coming up with testable hypotheses there. And that's appealing to me.
Chapter 8 deals with coincidences. I think everyone has had coincidences. In my early life, I was fascinated by Carl Jung's synchronicity as indicating a kind of non-causal correlations, indicating some deep realities beyond our ken. And I think Sue, 25 years ago when I first met her, made the point that the key to understand coincidences is to understand the coincidences that did not occur.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if you have one that seems to be one chance in a quadrillion, if you think about all the coincidences that could have happened that didn't, there's almost an infinite amount. Yeah. I think she used the example that if you have a dream that your father died and your father dies within a period of time, she said in the UK there are 50 million people, how many deaths, and you can calculate some kind of thing. But if it happens to you, it's the one example. The analogy I like is if you say you hit a golf ball and it lands on a particular strand of grass, well, what's the odds of that happening? It's 1 in 100 million, however many there are strands of grass, but it had to land on some strand of grass.
Yeah. No, that's it. No, I mean every moment of every day we're kind of swimming in a sea of potential coincidences, and most of them we won't even notice. We won't even notice that they're there, but occasionally we will, and it is a very kind of it attracts our attention. It makes sense that it would do in terms of evolutionary psychology, because sometimes it will actually be meaningful. Sometimes it's not just a coincidence. There's some kind of explanation behind it. But sometimes it will be just a coincidence. And people find it very, very difficult to think in terms of things just being a coincidence. So things like precognitive dreams or telephone telepathy, where people think they know who's phoning them before they actually pick up the phone, and so on. Coincidence goes a long way to explaining those kinds of phenomena.
Did you have a most difficult to explain coincidence?
I don't personally, but what's really interesting is that somebody, another psychologist in this area, a guy called David Marks, who wrote classic books about debunking Uri Geller and various other skeptical works over the years, including writing about the psychology of coincidence. He recently came out with, and I would have classified him as being an extreme skeptic, but his most recent book on the psychology of the paranormal, he seems to have changed his position quite dramatically on the basis of what he sees as being a series of coincidences that happened to him personally, and the impact was such that he's now kind of, I think, changed his position quite considerably. He's still not at all impressed by the data coming out from controlled laboratory studies of telepathy and psychokinesis and so on, but he's arguing that maybe it sometimes occurs spontaneously in everyday life, but it will never be captured in the laboratory. And that's quite a turnabout for somebody who was such an extreme skeptic.
That tracks a little bit of my own thinking. I've thought along similar lines. In chapter 9, Tricks of the Mind, you have a term, just briefly explained, transliminality.
That was an idea that was put forward by a parapsychologist called Michael Falborn. He is no longer with us, sadly, but he was putting it forward as a possible explanation for ESP, because he is a believer, or was a believer, I should say. And the basic idea is that if you think of the mind as having some parts of non-conscious, some parts of conscious, and you have you can conceive it as being a kind of semi-permeable membrane between them, and sometimes the non-conscious stuff passes through into conscious awareness, and that this membrane varies in terms of its permeability. So he was putting it forward as an explanation that ESP might have its roots in non-conscious processes that in some people do actually make it through into consciousness. I thought it was an interesting idea from a skeptical perspective, the idea that we might sometimes pick up on information in our environment without being consciously aware of it. And then when we make decisions on the basis of that information that we weren't consciously aware of, we might think, well, I must be psychic then. I've no other explanation, And we carried out some experimental work that offered some support for that.
Chapters 10 and 11, you have great stories about dreams of the future and the skeptical inquiries. I'd like to focus just a little bit on chapter 12, which turns us around a little bit and asks, can we learn lessons for the living? Where you say anomalistic psychology can be a painless way of learning important critical thinking skills. How so?
Well, again, I think for most people, the kind of evidence that they would find most convincing is their own personal experience. And that's a very human, very natural position to take. As a psychologist, I would say it's not the correct position to take, because we're all prone to these kind of biases, hallucinatory experiences, failures of memory, etc., that I talk about throughout the book. Sometimes you'll hear skeptics saying, I've never seen a ghost, so I don't believe in them. Well, even if I thought I'd seen a ghost, I don't think you should believe in them. and it's really important, I think, to a lot of the times, the critical thinking is not about telling people what to think, but maybe trying to help them in terms of how to think, how to evaluate evidence. And part of that is being aware of the biases that we all suffer from. We've got reasoning biases. We've got biases of interpretation. We're all very poor at understanding probabilities and so on and so forth. And all these kind of different factors come into play. Now, knowing about them doesn't give you 100% protection from them, but I think it may help. And so, that is a kind of an important lesson for me from anomalistic psychology. Try to make you be aware of the fact that you've got these imperfections in the cognitive system. We all have them.
I really like the epilogue, the limits of skepticism. You referred to that a little bit before, but you give some opposite views and then your own kind of nuanced view. Why did you end with that chapter or that epilogue?
To be quite honest with you, That epilogue wasn't there in the original draft of my manuscript, which was
Oh,
sent out to 4 reviewers, and they all said very nice things about it, for which I'm eternally grateful. But one of them did say, might be interesting to include something about the limits of skepticism. And my editor
uh,
liked that idea. And I kind of thought, yeah, it is quite a nice idea. But I then had to write another chapter. Um, and I basically, what I did in that section was to kind of pose the question, well, what would it take to turn me back into a believer? You know, what kind of experience or data or evidence what would it take? And just kind of basically, I used the epilogue to explore that idea.
Chris, I liked when you write that, quote, to quote you, proper skepticism is to always be open to the possibility that you may be wrong. And therefore, you say, I have always devoted some time to directly testing paranormal claims. So, what are some of the things that you have done?
There's been quite a wide range, really. I'm ranging from I've had one or two PhD students who were complete believers and set out to basically prove their supervisor wrong by hope they hoped they would produce evidence that would show that paranormal phenomena were real. Didn't happen. I've often taken part in TV documentaries where we've had to test some kind of psychic claimant under properly controlled conditions. And again, they've never actually passed the tests. We've done a few tests of psychic claimants, people going for uh, various big cash prizes that were around for a long time. James Randi had $1 million on offer
Right.
for anybody who could demonstrate psychic ability under controlled conditions. It's now gone down to a measly 500,000, so I can understand why people have lost interest. And then there's been other stuff which has been more kind of more academic. Very, very kind of strictly controlled stuff, very much along the lines of an experimental psychology study, except that we're investigating some kind of paranormal claim.
Mm. You mentioned that you're working on lucid dreams, maybe precognitive. You said you're working with Julia Mossbridge, who
Mm-hmm.
we've talked to.
Yeah, no, that was really interesting, and we've agreed that we're not going to kind of announce the results until we get the paper actually accepted. The good news is that the revised version, we got positive feedback on the initial version. It's now been revised. We're just waiting for all of the different people who were involved in it to give the go ahead, and then we'll resubmit that, and it should be, we hope, accepted for publication very soon. And that's a paper that I talk about in the epilogue of the book, because at that time we had got some data, but we were carrying out a big confirmatory study. So I'm afraid I can't actually tell you the results yet, but watch this space.
Yeah, but I have precognitive ability, so I know what the paper is. So you don't have to tell me. I've
Okay.
already figured it out. What's the story of Bell and Simon? You have a big account of that, and really seem moved by it.
That was a really interesting experience. Again, as I said, I had to write this epilogue. I didn't know what I was going to put in it, and I just happened to get an email with the intriguing title of "Not a Ghost Story." So I kind of read a bit further, and this person declared that I'll bet you get lots of emails like this from people who are assuring you that they're not crazy, but I'm honestly not. I've got a respectable career. I am Googleable in a good way, she said. And I could tell I could have a good guess at what her name was from her email address. So I Googled her and found out that, yes, indeed, she does have a very respectable career. And then she told me what had happened to her. She basically had started off as an atheist and a total skeptic regarding the paranormal, as was her partner. He unfortunately died. And then after that, various things started happening in her life that she began to take as being signs from him. And long story short, in the end, she had become not only a believer in the paranormal, but also a believer in God.
Mm.
And it was an interesting kind of exercise insofar as her account was not going to be enough to convince me that psi is real. But the question I kind of posed as a thought experiment was, how would I react if it had happened to me rather than her? And the honest answer is I just don't know. I just don't know.
And what's your answer to that? You
I
just
just don't know. I mean, it may be that, something like that could happen. And I go on then to describe the experience of David Marks, somebody who was an extreme skeptic,
yeah.
who seems to have changed his position on the basis of certain events that have happened in his personal life. And so who can say?
So you also talk about that one of the profound lessons that you've learned from decades of working in psychology and parapsychology is the need to be aware of the weaknesses as well as the strengths of the scientific method. So I
Absolutely.
know that we know the strengths. What are the weaknesses?
Well, as you're probably aware, psychology has been going through what's been referred to as the replication crisis
Yeah,
for
40%.
many years now. I mean, it's not just parapsychology that has problems with
No, of
replication,
course.
but it is,
Medical
I would say,
research.
it's the single biggest problem that parapsychology has. But psychology also has issues, and so a lot of the kind of classic studies that were in the textbooks for decades, which we all thought were real effects, looks like a lot of them probably weren't. And this raises a whole host of questions. Well, where are these positive results coming from? And obviously, all sciences have a certain element of fraud, but it's relatively rare, I think. What's more pernicious is what are referred to as questionable research practices. And this basically refers to the fact that if you are carrying out any kind of experiment, there are lots of decision points that are involved. And you may kind of give yourself the benefit of the doubt in terms of whether you include all the data or you have a look at it and you take out any outliers, or whether you transform the data statistically and so on. In other words, there's lots of ways in which you can give yourself more than one bite of the cherry. And they can produce spuriously significant results, things that look like they're significant, but they aren't.
Well,
And
one of the problems with meta studies is that you may have a good methodology of dealing with the published results, but the assumed bias is that all the null results weren't published because they weren't interesting,
well,
and
yeah,
and that to me is the biggest problem with meta studies.
I mean, that is a big problem. I mean, it's one that parapsychologists are aware of, and they try to deal with it. But I don't think you always can. I've had experiences where I've been collaborating with parapsychologists, and we've got part way through the study, and for whatever reason, we didn't manage to finish it. I mean, again, only so many hours in a day, and logistically, these things can be quite demanding. But if you look at the data that you've got so far, and there's absolutely no evidence of a significant effect, it's much easier to drop that study, just never finish it. And of
Right.
course, that then doesn't go. It's not just the studies that are completed that don't
Oh,
produce positive results. It's also the studies that never get completed,
yeah,
because
good
you
point.
realize that why put more effort into this? It's not going to produce anything. From a,
Hmm.
from a psychologist point of view, publishing in parapsychology journals wouldn't look that great on my CV anyway. So I'm not that motivated to kind of write it up. Uh, but I have, as like I say, I've had PhD students who've done methodologically sound work. Not that much of it ever got published because they never found any positive results.
Yeah, but that itself is an important result, and
Yeah.
and should be included within a meta study. So that is a problem. Um, the famous article by Professor Darrell Bem in 2011 of 9 experiments to supposedly support precognition was given a lot of credit because it was published, not in a parapsychological journal, but in a first-rate psychology, social science journal. You in fact tried to replicate that, which I admire because that's an important thing, but obviously failed. And then you kind of complained that you couldn't get that published.
No, it's not just that we couldn't get it published; we couldn't get it sent out for peer review. It was being rejected without even being sent out for peer review by the original journal that had published Bem's results. And then we tried two other high impact journals and we got the same treatment. And this became a bit of a story in itself. We were getting more attention for this paper that we couldn't get sent out for peer review than I get for most of the stuff I've published. Quite insulting, really. But it was a really interesting lesson in terms of the bias of scientific publishing. Basically, it's very hard, first off, to just get straight replications published because editors want new findings, exciting findings, but that by definition means you don't know how reliable and replicable they are. And secondly, this was negative findings. We hadn't got a significant effect to report. And so we really struggled. In the end, we published it in PLOS One, which is an open access journal. It was this whole experience that's what converted me into having more faith in open access journals. I was a bit dubious about them before this, but there was a lot of interest in the fact that we hadn't replicated. I believe at one point we were getting 1,000 views a day for the paper, which is phenomenal for a scientific paper. But it made me think long and hard about issues like questionable research practices, why some parapsychologists seem to be able to get positive results, but when I tried to run the same experiments, I didn't. And I ended up with a situation where all sciences are about trying to separate the signal from the noise. And I just kind of wondered about what would a science look like if all you had was noise? And I think it might look a lot like parapsychology.
So what kind of evidence would make you alter your priors in a Bayesian sense? And why I think that's important is that parapsychological studies in general have thought that there's an experimenter effect, that the so-called sheep who believe and the goats who don't, that somehow that injects in this, whatever the mechanisms are, some sort of a bias into the equation. So it's not just poor methodology of the believers and good methodology of the skeptics. It's somehow their priors, their sense of things are modifying the situation almost in a Heisenberg quantum effect in some analogous way. So first of all, is that a fair analysis, what I just said? And secondly, what would change your priors?
Well, it's certainly the case that parapsychologists often present what they call as a sheep-goat effect. The sheep are the believers, the goats are the skeptics. And one type of sheep-goat effect is, they would say, you're much more likely to get significant positive results to support the existence of telepathy or clairvoyance or whatever if the experimenter is a believer than if they're a skeptic. Now, if it's the case that this is some kind of paranormal effect in itself, I put out so many negative vibes that I dampen.
I feel them. I feel them across the ocean.
Well, exactly. Yeah. I'm a very, very negative person. And, if that's the case, then I'm forever condemned to never witnessing these things with my own eyes, and I just either have to accept the accounts from other people or not. That's a different matter. But I think it's much more likely that what we're seeing there relates back to this idea of questionable research practices. Now, I'll explain how. If I carry out an experiment within mainstream psychology on an effect that I very much expect to get, and I run my experiment, I do my analysis, and the effect doesn't seem to have come out, I'm much more likely then to go and have a look at the raw data, there's a couple of outliers there. I think that was the guy who, I don't think he understood the instructions for the tap. You know what I mean? I'll think with a plausible, might even be true explanation for that. But I will basically torture the data until it confesses. Now, that's in a mainstream psychology context. If I'm doing a parapsychology experiment where I don't expect to get positive results, I do my analysis, I've not got a significant effect, I stop. Whereas a parapsychologist who expected to get the results will probably look at the raw data and try analysing it this way and that way and every other way. And interestingly, Bem, for most of his career, was highly recommending that approach. And we now see it as being kind of really bad advice. But, I'm pretty sure that I've published papers in mainstream psychology in the past. The effects probably weren't real. They were probably spurious, because I was giving myself the benefit of the doubt in terms of the analysis and squeezing this effect out that I was sure must be there. Didn't think I was doing anything wrong. We were all doing it. We didn't know any better. Whereas, now we do. We're much more aware of the dangers.
That's very profound broadly in behavioral studies and even medical studies in general, drugs and stuff. So that's a big improvement in our scientific method. But still, getting back to my question, what kind of evidence would make you question and alter your priors, bringing into it, make you kind of a trans between between a goat and a sheep.
I'm not sure that I could actually kind of change my priors insofar as, I mean, I haven't, I can't, you can change your beliefs. I've gone from being a believer to being a skeptic. You know, it can happen, but all kinds of different factors come into play there. And then once you kind of settle on a particular point on the continuum, the belief continuum, you'll probably stay there for a while until some big impact comes that makes you change your mind. So if the parapsychologist came up with a robust, replicable demonstration of a psi effect, then that would be enough to convince me. But I'm not holding my breath.
So obviously, the key from your perspective for psi research is consistently significant results that is replicable, and in your view, that has not happened yet. And I understand that, and that seems obvious. But perhaps there's another explanation, and you have a section called "What if Psi Only Happens Spontaneously?" You mentioned the David Marks story where he had this personal experience, and then transformation, and then he became what is called a zetetic. So tell me what a zetetic means.
I think a zetetic is somebody who kind of withholds judgment, basically, as far as I understand it.
So
So
an agnostic is applied to the paranormal.
I guess that would probably be a fair description. Yeah.
But you're not there yourself.
I'm not. No, I'm not. If I'm honest, then I kind of often answer this question the way that the late Bob Morris, the Koestler Chair of Parapsychology, used to answer it. He would do what you asked me to do earlier. He would kind of give you a number on a continuum from 0 to 100 and say, well, at the moment, you know, I'm 60% convinced, or I'm 70% convinced, and I kind of have that kind of approach. So, I mean, I suppose I'm an agnostic or a zetetic, if you prefer, in the sense that I acknowledge that there is a chance that I might be wrong and that some of these things might be real. But if I had to bet my house on whether or not paranormal phenomena genuinely exist, I know which way I'd bet.
Yeah, my own view, and I was very interested in parapsychology in my early days. In fact, I will confess to you that I was invited by J.B. Rhine in the 60s to do my PhD with him in parapsychology when I was an undergraduate. I chose neurophysiology at the Brain Research Institute at UCLA, which turned out to be a wise choice for a late teenager. And then my interest declined and really didn't follow it for decades. But with Closer to Truth, we've explored it to a degree, and I wouldn't have called myself a zetetic, although I appreciate the both the agnosticism and the idea that maybe, as you said, David Marks suggested, that psi is a spontaneous, unpredictable, uncontrollable, therefore not amenable to replicability in the same way. I put it differently. I would say that what if psi, by its very nature, by its fundamental nature, is not susceptible to the scientific method of experimentation and reproducibility, not only because of its spontaneity, but because of some fundamental mechanism that's associated with a deeper reality.
Well, I mean, again, people have put forward that kind of idea. I mean, and all I can say is that if that is the case, then I am condemned to never believing in something that is actually true, and I'll just have to live with that.
And it's a self a protective mechanism that you can't prove wrong. I mean, because you built into the hypothesis the impossibility of proving it wrong by the scientific method. It becomes an absurd kind of a circular process.
Yeah. So I mean, again, and in that sense, you could say, well, there again is a kind of an example of the limits of skepticism. Because logically, if that is the case, and who knows, it might be the case, well, skepticism will forever bar me from appreciating that truth.
I am reminded when I first met Dean Radin, and this was in 1999 on the very first Closer to Truth, when he said the best psychic individuals, if you got the best ones and you took them to Las Vegas, he had this great quote. He said, they will still lose all their money, but they will lose it a little slower.
Nice. Nice. Well, I mean, Dean was in his writings was predicting that by the year 2015 we'd have some um, aspects of technology that were based upon psi. I'm still waiting. It's not happened, so we'll see.
Chris, what can belief in the paranormal tell us about belief systems in general, whether they believe in religious views or political views? And you describe this very well in your great book, The Science of Weird Shit, Why Our Minds Conjure the Paranormal.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I often would tell my postgraduates, because sometimes they were a little bit worried about, oh, what kind of a job are they going to get next? What kind of position will they get if they've been doing all this paranormal stuff? Will people take them seriously? And I would explain to them that there are ways of presenting these things, that what we're really interested in is the effects of belief on perception, on memory, on interpretation, on reasoning, and so on and so forth. And it just so happens that we've chosen paranormal belief. And there are good reasons for doing that. The reasons being that there's a nice spread of beliefs within society, from complete skepticism up to complete unquestioning belief and all points in between. That these kind of beliefs, for some people, are very, very central part of their core self-image, whereas for others they're kind of quite peripheral. They don't really care one way or the other whether this stuff is for real or not. They're often held with great emotional conviction, and so there are a lot of properties there of paranormal beliefs that made it great as a way of studying the effects of belief on things like memory, judgment, reasoning, and so on and so forth. And the results would generalize. I mean, sometimes we would be looking at kind of research in other areas. I mean, the obvious examples would be things like religious beliefs, political beliefs,
Right.
but even kind of, which football team you support and the way that you kind of perceive a match. The classic studies where you always see the other sides of being kind of dirtier players. They're more likely to foul than our good guys, And again, it generalizes. So, yeah.
And so, if I were interested in studying religious belief or political belief, both of which in the U.S. are significant topics today, how would your study of the paranormal be able to reflect on those things? I mean, what specific kinds of psychological tools or categories can you learn more from the paranormal in understanding the religious or political belief than from just studying the religious or political belief by itself?
I wouldn't necessarily say that you can necessarily learn more. It's just a kind of complementary approach. For a long time, people who self-identified as skeptics, certainly back from from mid-70s onwards for a couple of decades, avoided religious topics. And I think to some extent, anomalistic psychology avoided religious topics. But you can't. You just can't do it, because some of the subject matter of anomalistic psychology is inherently religious by nature. I mean, prime examples would be things like near-death experiences. The kind of spiritual figures that you feel you're meeting during the experiences is going to be influenced by your religion, um, and you just can't get away from it. I mean, obviously, any evidence relating to life after death has implications both for parapsychology, the paranormal, and for religions. And so, anomalistic psychology, by taking, if you like, a kind of more kind of scientific approach, for example, understanding the nature of sleep paralysis, certainly explains a lot of beliefs about demons and so on. A lot of those kinds of accounts could well be explained in terms of sleep paralysis. That's not something that you necessarily would have come to by just studying the psychology of religion.
And that's what I was trying to get at. What are the aspects of the paranormal that can highlight facets of religious or political belief that the paranormal would tease apart, that would be hidden as a secondary or tertiary causation of belief systems in religion or politics, but the paranormal, because it brings that up more strongly can help us to perceive that underlying motivation.
Again, I mean, I think that the approach of anomalistic psychology rather than parapsychology, because I mean, I'm first and foremost an anomalistic psychologist.
Right.
I'm not a parapsychologist. Um, but I mean, I think that greater appreciation of the kind of cognitive biases, the way our minds work. I mean, one influential approach within the area of the psychology of religion talks about intentionality, or I mean, Michael Shermer calls it agenticity, but the idea that when something happens out in the world, it's because someone or something made it happen with particular and that whatever it was has particular intentions towards us. Now, that's an idea that has been put forward as a possible explanation for a lot of religious concepts, but also clearly it applies to a lot of paranormal concepts, things like belief in demons, in witches, in other kinds of supernatural beings. And so I think it's just a kind of a way of a different perspective.
I think that different perspective is really important. I mean, let's just take it even further to political beliefs, in which emotionality and the valence of the emotional response. We see that in American politics now, which is the most divisive in our current lifetimes in terms of political views. Can you study that deep emotional conviction in the paranormal? Because if somebody's had that experience, that emotion, that the valence of emotionality in that is very high.
Well, that's right. I mean, and again, I think this kind of crops up particularly when it comes to topics like belief in conspiracy theories, which of course are really very, very important part of American politics in particular, thanks to he who shall not be named. But you've got that kind of situation where people can end up believing something so strongly that there's no evidence that can convince them that they're wrong. I mean, there's a friend of mine, Stephen Law, a philosopher. He talks about this idea of intellectual black holes, the idea that there are certain belief systems that once you're on the inside of them, it's incredibly difficult to get out.
Good,
And conspiracy
good
theories
analogy.
is
Good analogy. Yeah.
the prime example. Any evidence that counts against the conspiracy has obviously been planted there by the conspirators. You don't need to take it seriously. Now, yeah, that's a particularly kind of obvious example, I suppose. But we all have this confirmation bias, and it crops up everywhere. It crops up, as I say, it crops up with respect to religious beliefs, political beliefs, even watching a football match. It's pervasive. We all have it. Being aware of it doesn't make it go away, but it might make you a little bit more aware that sometimes your views and your beliefs and your experiences are kind of coloured by these kind of factors.
Yeah, look, I should confess my own belief system, and I gave you the story that I almost did a PhD with J.B. Ryan in parapsychology at Duke. So that's one side of it. But the other side of it is when I first was thinking about doing Closer to Truth, and I consulted with 3 or 4 people. One of the experts I consulted was Paul Kurtz, who was the founder of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, which of course you have supported. So I've been very much bimodally schizophrenic on the issue.
Yes.
All right, look, let's have some fun, and I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and my question may be a little bit long, but your answer has to be very short. And in general, it's a scale of 0 to 100 of the likelihood of the following things I'm going to ask. And 0 means impossible in principle, and 100 means absolute certainty. So let's
Okay.
go through it, 0 to 100, and see if we tease these things apart. So number one, these are some obvious questions, that there will be at least one instance of telepathy, mind reading, which will be impossible to explain by the current laws of physics, 0 to 100.
10.
2, at least one instance of clairvoyance, sensing at a distance without the senses, will be impossible by the current laws of physics, 0 to 100.
10.
So that's the interesting part, that you are equating the likelihood of clairvoyance and telepathy. I, for one, would have made telepathy a little higher or clairvoyance a little lower. Telepathy, I can sort of imagine a mechanism. Clairvoyance is where I'm communicating with something
Yeah.
non-mental. Seems a little harder. All right, number 3. At least one instance of precognition, knowing the future, will be impossible by the current laws of physics.
10.
Okay, so you're being
I'm,
consistent. I
I'm
would not be so consistent, but okay. 4, at least one instance of psychokinesis, mind moving matter, will be impossible to explain by the current laws of physics.
5. There you are. A bit of variability.
Okay, good, plus. Number 5, parapsychology will become at some point recognized increasingly as a legitimate scientific field.
I am unusual here. I think parapsychology at its best is a science, so but being recognized as a science is different. I'm going to say 80.
So 80, that's an important distinction, which I didn't make. So 80 as a legitimate scientific field is a good answer.
I
Whether
think it's legitimate, yeah. And I think at its best, it's just as scientific as other areas. Science is a method. It's a methodology. Yeah,
that's a great answer. It's not
yeah.
what I expected. That's a great answer. 6, is consciousness entirely physical with nothing non-physical needed, such that an advanced neuroscience will entirely explain our inner awareness? 0 to 100.
50.
Good, interesting.
Completely on the fence.
Number 7, will AI ever become conscious as we are conscious?
70.
70.
No,
Okay.
maybe that's too high. I'm going to go 50 again. Sorry, I've changed my
Okay.
mind. 50.
I think that
Again, I'm on the fence on that one.
yeah, and look, we all have different opinions, and this is just snap judgments. But I would have 6 and 7, conscious entirely physical, and AI. I would have them very similar together. 8, is virtual immortality possible in principle, where our first person consciousness can be uploaded to another medium, not a clone, but actually you? 0 to 100.
25.
Yeah, I would definitely be lower than AI consciousness
Yeah.
on that as well. I'd be even less, but okay. 9. If you were to come, if you were to come to believe, this is a counterfactual question. If you were to come to believe that consciousness does have non-material aspects, you said you're 50-50. So in the 50 that you would come to believe that it does, would that give you more credence to the reality of paranormal events? 0 to 100.
100. Yeah, it would.
Okay, good. I would be there. So now let's take that in reverse. If you were to become convinced that any paranormal events, any, violate the current laws of physics, would that give you more credence to consciousness being, at least in part, non-physical?
80. 80. Yeah.
11, possibility of life after death in a real sense. 0 to 100.
20.
Oh,
20.
okay, interesting.
I got a little bit higher than the 10, you know.
Okay, good. Yeah, this is not designed to think too hard. So finally, and this you can give a little bit, a couple sentences if you like. Have your decades of investigating claims of speaking to the dead or reincarnation or past lives, has it affected at all your personal belief in the possibility of life after death?
Yeah, yes, I think it has. Yeah, I think it has. I'm kind of more convinced that there is not life after death than I would have been if I hadn't spent all that time looking
So
into
the
it.
results has been, with all the data, a negative. You might have had a
Yeah,
pre-sense but having all this so-called evidence as you've investigated it actually decreased your
yeah.
sense of the reality. Okay,
Yep,
fair
yep.
position. Viewers can watch over 1,500 Closer to Truth videos and over 100 Closer to Truth TV episodes on mind and consciousness on the Closer to Truth website and YouTube channel, brain mechanisms, free will, personal identity, panpsychism, dualism, idealism, yes, souls and spirits, life after death, cosmic consciousness, and even ESP and parapsychology, but all infused with critical thinking. We appreciate your support of Closer to Truth. Tell your friends, like our videos, donate as you can. Thanks for watching. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing. Closer to Truth is now accepting your tax-exempt donations. Please come to closertotruth.com/donate. Thank you very much for supporting us, and thanks for watching.